Hello and welcome to this episode of For Your Consideration. My name is Guy and today we are looking at the 10 influential works that created, well, me. This was a question posed on Facebook. What works influenced me? What 10 works specifically influenced me? And I've broken it down into 3 categories. And I have got some overlap, so there's not just 10, there's a few more than 10. As I say, I have my top 10, 50 movies, because it's so difficult to sort of look and pinpoint specifically this or that. And well, hopefully as I go through this, I was a child of the 1980s, growing up in South Africa, which censored quite a lot of stuff as well when I was growing up anyway, but they did certainly let a few things through, and that's what has influenced me. Now, would I suggest that you go along and try and find all of the movies that I talk about or the books that I talk about? The books, yes, absolutely. I believe that they are universal. Some of them are a little bit junior grade. We are talking about things that influenced me as I was growing up as a role player, so everything basically from the age of 5 to 20, I suppose, is listed here, various bits and pieces. Some of them might be a little bit lowbrow in terms of you if you're over 20, but generally speaking, these are still enjoyable today, if not for nostalgic reasons, then for any other. So if we look at movies includes television series as well, and I've had to try and squeeze them in. Now, the very first movie that I can recall having a major impact on me was the Disney movies, and in particular this one here, The Sword and the Stone, where we're dealing with the story of King Arthur and Merlin the Wizard, and Merlin turns the wart into various different things, a fish and a squirrel, and then there's a magic battle, and that kind of stuff. That really captured my imagination. Other Disney films that sort of stand out, Sleeping Beauty with that wonderful queen, and so it's those kinds of films that captured my imagination and then kind of held on to it. But what really cemented in my mind anyway, this idea of fantasy world with knights and dragons and wizards and witches and all that kind of stuff must be the film Willow. Now, if you watch it today, the effects are definitely dated. This was a film that was made, I think, in the early 90s, the late 80s, where they were really pushing technology. It was the late 90s, actually, early 90s, actually. They were really trying to push the technology of the time. They still hadn't really got to computer effects yet. They were busy in the process of doing it. So it's a lot of puppetry, a lot of stop motion animation, all those kinds of old-fashioned things. So this is a great Saturday afternoon movie to watch, where you can really just get a sense that this is a magical world. It certainly feels like a D&D campaign, if ever there was one, between this halfling, I suppose we'd call them, and this human warrior and the pixies. And it's a fantastic, typical fantasy kind of movie. It's a wonderful, wonderful film. Then we, of course, have Star Wars. Star Wars influenced me in huge ways. Even though the films came out before I was really cognizant. I mean, the first one came out before I was even born. The next 2, I was 3 at the time the last one came out. So the idea here was that when I saw these films, I became absolutely I was enraptured, completely blown away by these. Now we're talking about the original 3 films, so New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. And what they did was they showed me that, yes, although the humans dominate as the heroes, there's lots of aliens out there, there's lots of different creatures out there that are making significant contributions and really helping the world to become a better place in this particular case. I think it was at that time that I started to fall in love with the bad guys more than with the good guys. Emperor Palpatine I thought was fantastic. He was this ugly old man, but he had so much power, and everyone was absolutely in fear of him. And you have Grand Moff Tarkin, who was this really regal, very noble-looking sort of villain. So that, for me, really kind of cemented it. Star Trek, of course, exactly the same idea, but here even more so the idea that we've got different races working together towards a common cause. And I think that as the TV show evolved and changed. The first Next Generation shows weren't allowed on our television in the 80s because of all of the black characters that were in the show. So when it did eventually come out, this was in the early 90s, it was fantastic to watch and to see this world that we were exploring as a country, but that was being explored already in a science fiction type environment where everyone is a much better place. And, well, except, of course, for the other nations, the Romulans and the Klingons and those kinds of things. But the idea there was to really come to grips with multinational, diverse environments, but also the idea of the storytelling that came through, because the storytelling of Star Trek was very different at that stage anyway from a lot of other shows out there. It was much more about the idea of longer narratives rather than these very short narratives. And if you watch The Next Generation, which was done in 1987 and moved on from there, the idea there was that each episode was fairly self-contained. Nothing really spilled over from one episode to the other, except that over the long course of the series, things started to evolve. These bigger narratives started to appear that hadn't necessarily been there before. So that was really great for me. Then another film, this one I saw, I think I was about 8. I owned the DVD of this before I owned a DVD player. I'll never forget, I was in the UK en route to the USA, my first trip out that way, and I came across this DVD store, and it had the Excalibur DVD in it, which was fantastic. And then John Borman, who directed the film, was out at a film festival here, and I heard him talk on the writing of Excalibur and how they sort of generated and came up with it. But if you look at Excalibur, the armor that they're using, it was really the first time that we'd seen medieval armor used as this heavy-duty, rugged stuff that protected the wearer from certain weapons and not from others. And we got the idea that swords weren't the greatest option when fighting a knight in full armor. You wanted to use an axe or a flail, something that could really damage that armor. And again, just this wonderful, wonderful idea of sorcery in the background. So a very grim kind of world that we explored. And then, of course, finally, He-Man and the Master of the Universe. This, I will never forget, one of my most embarrassing moments, which I still to this day cling to for being so embarrassed, but also an absolutely loving memory of my mother, is that I was about 5 years old. And in those days, we had VHS. And when He-Man would come on, we'd record it so that I could then watch them over and over and over and over and over again. And my mother was saying goodbye to some family friends, I think. And I was sitting watching television, and a promo for He-Man came on. But I didn't know that. I just saw the He-Man logo. And I'm running out into the driveway of the house shouting, "Mum, it's He-Man, it's He-Man, it's He-Man, we've got to record." I didn't know how to do it at that stage. My poor old mother left the guest standing there, ran inside, threw a VHS into the machine and started recording. That's how desperate she was to support her little child, or to keep him quiet, I suppose, as this promo played out. And then, of course, the promo finished. My mother looked at me and she said, "No, sorry, it isn't Friday or Monday or whenever those shows used to play. It's just a promo telling you that it's coming. Now, please come outside and apologize to the guests for pulling me out." So I had to go out and apologize to the guests for pulling my mother away from them. I still remember that. It's terrifying. But I still watch He-Man. And when they released the 2000 remake, I watched that avidly as well. And the shows have got so many plot holes in them. They've got gigantic plot holes in them. But there's like 124 of them. That's 124 plots sitting there that you can look at and go, well, the Diamond of Disappearing, it's actually not a bad magical item. Okay, great. And it's a mining colony that's got it in their dungeon for whatever reason. Skeletor was, and still remains to this day, one of my most influential villains. If you had to sort of give me my favourite villain of all time, it would be Skeletor. Here's someone who's got a tremendous amount of capacity and capability, but he always seems to screw it up, or his minions screw it up. And he doesn't take into account He-Man, even though he knows He-Man is there every single time. So those are my sort of film and TV inspirations. If we then turn to the books, you'll see that the books are very teenager-based books, and there's one author here that I have left off, and that's for a very specific reason. I completely forgot about it, even though he's probably the most influential. And that would have to be Terry Pratchett's Discworld series. The Discworld series said, here is a fantasy space, but we're not taking anything seriously except the art of storytelling. That we are taking seriously. And I remember devouring his books. I think I've read everything that he's ever written, and absolutely loved them, except for his later works, the books he started to write towards the end of his life. For me, I stopped being engaged with him because they stopped being his acerbic commentary on life and became a bit more cookie cutter, more generic. And that for me didn't work. What worked for me with Terry Pratchett's books was the fact that he took a traditional idea and then put it on its head. A wizard who can't cast spells. A box that has multiple legs and follows around the characters with all of their luggage in it, but it eats anybody who tries to break into it. Fantastic ideas. Dragons that only exist if you imagine them, and once you get out of a certain area, there's not enough magic to keep them around anymore, so then they disappear. Just some great fundamental role-playing shenanigans, is the only word really to use. That was just so wonderful and so inspirational. I remember, again, another memory of my mother was she was trying to read books to me that would engage me so that it would keep me reading. And she tried to read the very first Colour of Magic to me. And she got lost between the breakout points, because the way Pratchett writes, he's got lots of asterisks. And sometimes you read there's an asterisk next to a phrase, and then you go and read the paragraph that relates to the asterisk. And in one of the books, or multiple books actually, there's asterisks with an asterisk. So you end up reading 4 pages of book and then having to go back again to find where you were to carry on reading your actual sentence. So to try and read that out aloud, I think is quite a challenge. And one that my mother eventually said, you know what, you can read these books on your own because I can't. But that was enough. That sparked me to want to go and read these. Anyway, so we go back to the books that I have listed here. We've got The Once and Future King by T.H. White. Now, this is quite an interesting collection of books, as a matter of fact. It's 4 or 3 books that have been combined together. And you'll notice The Once and Future King, if you know what it is, it's the story of Arthur and Merlin and Guinevere and Lancelot and company, told by T.H. White. He took the original sort of fables and retold it and reworked it. And that's what the movie The Sword and the Stone is based on. It's based on the very first book in that series. So the book, as well as the film, inspired me. The film kind of visually gave me these clues and was very humorous and very light-hearted. The book is also slightly tongue-in-cheek, quite funny for the way it's written, his prose, his particular style, but it's much more serious. So big influence was The Once and Future King. The Belgrade by David Eddings was majorly influential. I read it when I was about 13 or 14, and it's a series of 5 books that follows along this character Garion as he learns to become a mage. Now the magic system that Eddings had in that book was rather interesting. It was all opposite forces and things that you had to sort of balance out and get to grips with. And that was an interesting journey because that was really like a campaign, those 5 books. I hadn't ever read anything at that point that had that sort of narrative to it, where it was 5 successive books that you had to read. What I was very disappointed with was his sequel, The Malorian, which he released, I felt was just a retelling of The Belgrade. So I never actually finished reading The Malorian. However, The Belgrade was a very interesting read. It was very light-hearted. It's a typical story, farm boy becomes king of the world type of thing. Typical hero's journey. Lone Wolf was the Choose Your Own Adventure books. Now, he eventually wrote Joe Dever, I think I stopped collecting on 25 of these Choose Your Own Adventure books. Just this phenomenal output of material, and quite difficult books too. Not a lot of Choose Your Own Adventure books will kill you off as quickly as the Lone Wolf books used to do. But again, there was an idea of a combat system. There was an idea that your character moved forward. They had an equipment list. So they could pick up stuff and drop off stuff. And more importantly, carry from one book to the next. So if you didn't do book 2, you didn't get the Suma sword. And if you didn't get the Suma sword, you really couldn't defeat the Dark Lords of Helgadad as you moved on. Now, that was really, really influential. And when I look at my first map of Braxia that I built, this homebrew, custom-made world of mine, that first map is very similar to Joe Dever's first map, which was what inspired me to actually create my own map later on. Well, not my own map, because that first one was my own map, but it was too heavily influenced by Dever. So I then went on and said, okay, cool, I'm going to remake Braxia in a different image, and that's where we go. And then of course Fabled Lands by Dave Morris and Jamie Thomason was again just opening up my eyes that sometimes you don't have to have an actual central plot. You can just have lots of little plots strung together. Now, I advocate on the channel that you have a grand epic campaign. I do think that those are still the most entertaining to play, but Fabled Lands allowed you to do whatever you wanted. You could become a sea captain, you could go and become an explorer. If you want to experience what Fabled Lands is like, I'm doing a playthrough now of the books on this channel, as a matter of fact. They come out every Saturday. But Fabled Lands really opened up my eyes that you should not restrict your players in any shape, form or fashion as to what they do, because there is fun to be had in every angle. You just need to find that fun. So those are the books that influenced me. And I know that some of you are sitting there going, where's The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings? I read The Lord of the Rings, and it took me 3 months to chew through that book. Then I did it again when I was in university, and it took me 3 weeks because I wasn't studying and I really had a lot of time on my hands. It's a good book, and as a foundation, I know it inspired a lot of the authors that I refer to here, except for White, who was writing at the same time, but as Tolkien. But for me, it wasn't amazingly, wonderfully mind-blowing. It was great, and it definitely set what elves are like and what orcs are like, and good versus evil and all those kinds of wonderful things. But I think there was just too much book for someone of my age, perhaps, or my attention span anyway. The Hobbit I thoroughly enjoyed, and I read that every now and again, as a matter of fact. So anyway, those are the books. And then other sources. I know this is going to sound trite. It's going to sound like I'm doing lip service. But other game masters, playing in other game masters' games, gets me into their world, and that's the most amazing space to be in. And if that doesn't inspire you, if that doesn't help you, drive you, push you to go further, I don't know what. And if I look at what's come across my desk this year alone, I've got things from Rodney Sloan. I want to say Firebird Publishing, but I don't think that's right. I'll put a link below anyway. They released modules for 5th edition, and they came up with this amazing book for DM's Guild, which had Saurians in it. I look at Degenesis, which is this post-apocalyptic, post-medieval type of setting, which is again unbelievable, that comes out of Germany. I want to say Westworld, I'm looking at Westbound, Western kind of setting. So other GMs, other resources like that are really, really powerful. They're really influential. My very first GM was really, really tough, requiring us to keep track of days and iron rations and food and not giving out lots of treasure and making combat really difficult. It was really tough, but some of the greatest role-playing moments that I can remember. My second DM was hyper-prepared and used to get so frustrated with me as a character because my characters would want to explore the world that they're in rather than go on the adventures that the GM had prepared. So each of my GMs that I have been with in the past have inspired me to be better, to think outside the box, to think further. Some have given me different ways of starting a campaign or a session. So those really are heavily influential in my existence, I should say, and trying to push the theme. And of course, these influential works for me become the basis of my expectations. This is what I expect others to have in their past. If there's some of the age group, this is what I expect them to expect. And so that allows me to shape my games and to channel how to design adventures and things for them to keep them on their toes. Younger generations don't know these films or books. They're all Harry Potter type of aficionados and fans. So I also obviously have watched those, but they haven't been hugely influential on me because they didn't really push the boundaries very far in any one particular direction outside of what I have already experienced and known. And of course, these films and things, I'm sure, are predated by other books and influences for older players as well. So that's just the nature of life, isn't it? Anyway, these are my 10 influential works. Why don't you list below, so we can all have a look, your 10 influential works, and let's see if there's sort of common threads, or if they're completely different. Maybe My Little Pony, I don't know why that popped into my head as one of your influences. Maybe it's Harry Potter, maybe it's Goosebumps, that Choose Your Own Adventure series that came out in the late or early 90s, somewhere around there. Let us know what your influences were, and let's compare and influence each other. After all, that's why we're all here, is to learn from one another, isn't it? Anyway, until next time, I wish you and yours the happiest of weekends.